Welcome to the Machine Ethics Podcast. This month we're talking to Tim Taylor about everything evolving machines and robots and AI before the 1950s in culture. We're going to be talking about open-ended evolution, Descartes' notion of animals as machines, machine and human co-evolution, AI, environment and complexity, and the web as a genetic algorithm environment, and much, much more. You can find us on Twitter at machine_ethics, Patreon at patreon.com/machineethics, or on our website machine-ethics.net. A quick announcement before the podcast. We started a consultancy company called Ethical by Design for companies who are interested in leveraging AI in a responsible manner. For more information, check out ethicalby.design. Thank you and enjoy. Hi Tim, thanks for joining me on the podcast. If you could just quickly introduce yourself, that would be fantastic.
Sure, it's good to be here. So my name's Tim Taylor. I've been working in AI and peripheral subjects for 25 years or more. So at the moment, I'm currently taking some time out to develop some foundational technology, which I envisage will develop into some commercial output later on. As always, I'm currently sort of sitting on the borderline between academic research and commercialization. So I'm currently also an associate examiner for the University of London International Programs in Computing. So I have one foot in academia and the other in commercial development.
So you've got a book that's coming out, which is kind of all about the early history of robots and how that has played out in literature. Is that right?
That's right. Yes, it began as a exploration. It began actually about 4 years ago when I was working in Australia for a while, and I attended a conference in Sydney. Which was a philosophy conference, and the subject of that meeting was evolutionary thinking, and they were interested in the ways that ideas of evolution had infiltrated various other disciplines beyond biology and philosophy. So my colleague Alan Doran and I submitted a paper to that conference on the intertwined history of biology and computers. And at the time, we were really starting from the 1950s, sort of the dawn of the modern digital computer age. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to highlight some very early work from the 1950s of people writing computer programs to simulate evolution and to simulate ecologies. And there were some pretty spectacular experiments done sort of beginning right back in 1953 by a guy called Neil Sparacelli, who looked at evolving little organisms in his computer, and he had about 4K of RAM or something to play with. This was like a supercomputer at the time, and he was interested not as a lot of people do these days in using evolution as a kind of optimization method, as in genetic algorithms and that sort of thing. But Baracelli was more interested in recreating the open-ended nature of biological evolution. So using natural selection rather than artificial selection. He wasn't aiming for any specific outcome, but he just gave these organisms the properties of reproduction, mutation, and there was selection. So the ones which were most adapted to their environment and to living with the other programs in his system were the ones which were able to reproduce and therefore flourish. And he saw a lot of interesting phenomena, even in this really small system. He saw cooperation and sort of the evolution of organisms which were collections of individual units which were cooperatively reproducing as a mass, as it were. And he saw a whole load of other interesting phenomena. So that was really interesting work, and it kind of bothers me that that work isn't so well known even now, because this was really one of the sort of foundational studies of artificial life.
Is this pre-Conway's Game of Life?
Oh yes, way before that. Conway's Game of Life was the 1970 around then, right. I think. Yeah. So this was nearly 20 years before.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. So anyway, so that's where this all started. We were giving this paper at this Sydney conference on work from the 1950s. But in the process of researching that, I already had in the back of my mind there was some earlier work, not sort of practical implementations, but people thinking about this kind of thing, about evolving machines, even right back to the 1860s. And I knew a little bit about that. So after the conference, we then set to work on a larger paper, which would look at the earlier history of these ideas, going back from 1950s onwards is fairly well known, but before that is less well known. So we set out to document all of that. And then that grew. We ended up digging out a lot more than I had originally anticipated.
Right.
And so that's really where the book has born. This, what was originally going to be a paper in a journal, has now grown into a book. And it's now finished. The first draft is finished and is currently under review with a publisher. So we're hoping it's going to be published later this year.
And it's the title is "The Spectre of Self-Reproducing Machines: An Early History of Evolving Machines, or Evolving Robots, should I say?"
That's right. Yes, that's the current title. Whether the publishers will want to change it or not remains to be seen. But yes, that's what we're going with.
Is it a kind of a broad brush overview of the different developments within kind of cultural artifacts, so kind of literature and theatre and things like that, as well as because you pointed out the research that was done in the 1950s there. Is it more scientifically led, or is it a bit of both there?
It's a bit of both. Actually, yes, we do go into detail of the more scientific work from the 40s onwards, 1940s, but I was really interested in the origin of these ideas, and as such, I'm interested in sci-fi, so we cover a lot of early American pulp sci-fi from the 1920s onwards. You mentioned theatre. I obviously mention Capet's Rossum's Universal Robots from the 1920s, which had themes of machine reproduction and evolution. Literature from E.M. Forster in 1909, his sci-fi work, The Machine Stops, also had some mention of, or sort of allusions to, machine evolution. And then going back to the 1860s and 70s, I've very recently come across some work by George Eliot, which I hadn't. Yes, that's not even in the draft of our book. I need to add some to the add a section to our book about that. So George Eliot and various other authors in the late 19th century. So yeah, it's I want to be quite pluralistic about that, and I mean I acknowledge that ideas are often driven sort of in their exploratory stages. It's often not the scientists that are really pushing the ideas forward, but it's works of literature and art, which are where some of the most interesting ideas originate. So I wanted to cover all of that.
Yeah, and I think I believe strongly that kind of those two things interact, obviously, and they overlap and they have influence over each other. We're constantly facing these ideas that we created in fiction, like the Terminator and things like that, when we're talking to the public about AI research. And some of these things can be hugely beneficial and get over ideas or explore ideas, and some of them can be damaging in the way that we think of these types of technologies. Do you think within your research there was some clear thread that was fed through a lot of that work, or there was some sort of lineage going on there?
Yes, actually, in the book. So I should say we've also got a paper which will be presented at the this year's Artificial Life Conference in Tokyo, which is sort of a little snippet from the book, but we in the paper we focus more on the social implications and implications for the future evolution of humankind. So there's that too, but yeah, in the book, we really distinguish 4 stages in the evolution of these ideas, if you will. So the first step, and where the book starts, is really right back in the 17th century with Descartes. And as people were beginning to digest and think about the consequences of Descartes' views that animals were machines, and it's really in that period, so in the late 1600s, that you start to see people discuss the idea of self-reproducing machines. So there's some quotes from like the 1670s discussing that, saying, for example, you might say that, this is paraphrasing a bit, a guy called Bernard de Fontenelle, he said something like, you might say that animals are machines, but if I put a male dog machine and a female dog machine, male and female dog together, and leave them for a while, eventually you'll get a third little dog being produced. But if you put 2 watches side by side, you can leave them all you want, but they're never going to reproduce. So initially, the first inklings we see in writing about self-reproducing machines are really an argument, sort of an absurdio argument against Descartes' views of animals as machines.
Right.
But as you look further on into the 18th century and beginning of the 19th century, you see people start to refer to self-reproducing machines without necessarily out of hand rejecting the idea as obviously false. So that's step 1, really. The sort of setting into people's minds the idea that animals are machines. Step 2 was Darwin's introduction of The Origin of Species, the publication of that in 1859, which was obviously sort of foundational to the subsequent sort of development of thought of the idea that machines can not only self-reproduce but could also evolve.
Right.
So that's step 2.
Do you have to make a distinction that animals aren't machines at this point, or are we? Do you have kind of a singular belief that everything is mathematical and that therefore we are machines? Do you have a stance on that sort of thing?
Well,
I mean, do you agree with Descartes in that way?
Well, I guess you would. I would say I'm a materialist in that I do not think there's anything sort of. I don't believe that there is a separate world of consciousness and sentience that Descartes believed. Descartes reserved that for humans. He thought humans were distinguished amongst all animals and having this sort of sentient realm on top of all the mechanical aspects of the body. So I don't believe there's something extra, but at the same time, I acknowledge that we know very little about the nature of consciousness. So that's a huge sort of chasm in scientific understanding of intelligence at the moment. Yep. And there's some really interesting work going on in neural correlates to consciousness, and so what changes in neurons in someone's brain are associated with various different perceptions and conscious sensations. But that, as sort of impressive as that work is, it's never going to explain why. It's showing there's a correlation, but we don't really understand why it is that the sorts of things that human brains are produce consciousness, whereas computers presumably don't. But obviously, not knowing what consciousness is, we can't say whether a computer does or not.
Yeah. So to pull that question out on you, but this is the kind of podcast for that. So
sure. So yeah, I think. But that aside, it doesn't really come into. It's not sort of a main thread of what I'm discussing in this book, because that's really about the evolution of adaptive behavior and robots or machines or organisms that are able to behave appropriately in their environment. So I don't concern myself too much with that particular question of consciousness. You can, there's that opens up a whole new wormhole of problems that I choose to ignore in this work.
So you mentioned the popularization of the kind of the evolutionary notion that was published at the time. Do you want to continue from there?
Sure, yeah. So after Darwin's Origin of Species was published in 1859, so the next step was really the putting together these two ideas that animals are machines or machines are animals, and that animals can evolve, therefore machines can evolve. Right. And this really happened very quickly in the 1860s after the publication of The Origin of Species. And so what was really happening at that time in the mid-19th century, in addition to the new ideas about evolution from Darwin and Wallace and others, obviously this was coming at the end of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And so there were already, before The Origin of Species appeared, people were already witnessing in their day-to-day lives the ever-increasing complexity of machines around them. And so people were already worried in the early 19th century, 1840s, around then, about where this was taking us. Were all these machines getting more and more complicated every day? What's going to be the ultimate result of that? So Benjamin Disraeli had a great quote about this. So as well as being prime minister, he was an author, and he wrote a novel in 1844 called Coningsby, which was set in sort of the Industrial Revolution landscape of Britain. And there's a great passage in there where one of the characters has arrived in Manchester and looking at the factories and machines around him. The narrator says, "And why should one say that the machine does not live? It breathes, it moves, and has it not a voice? And yet the mystery of mysteries is to view machines making machines, a spectacle that fills the mind with curious and even awful speculation." So that was Benjamin Disraeli writing that in 1844. Which I think is quite staggering, because, well, essentially, in our book, I have a whole load of modern day quotes from the last 5 years, which are saying pretty much the same thing. I mean, that quote from 1844 could be a contemporary quote, and no one would bat an eyelid. But so that's really what the book and the paper are all about. Really trying to publicize the idea that all these debates about AI and the singularity and AGI that are going on at the moment are really part of a debate that's been going on for a very long time.
Yes, yeah, and like you say, it really does resonate, those sorts of ideas with how we've been talking about AIs in the last 7 years or so. Do you think that there's something about that debate that was there any crescendo to your work that you found at the time? Was there any resolutions or
yes,
anything that came out which we might be able to take forward today?
That's a really interesting idea or question. It kind of actually our research has shown is that it comes in waves. Interest in this idea.
Right.
So there will be various periods where there's quite a lot written, and ideas being bounced off other ideas.
Yep.
And then it kind of dies away for a bit, and then comes back, and then dies away for a bit. So the 1860s and 70s, there was quite a lot going on, and it sort of died out a little bit. There was work in other sort of related topics to AI and machine evolution, but not specifically about machines evolving and reproducing.
Yep.
Then it kind of came back again in the 1920s with American pulp science fiction, and also some scientific speculations in the 20s and 30s and 40s. Then things went a little quiet. Then there was a huge amount of work in the 1950s with people really starting to do the first fundamental work on sort of the scientific understanding of what is required to build a self-reproducing machine. So John von Neumann was really the pioneer of the theory of self-reproducing machines in the late 1940s, early 50s.
Yep.
And then in the 50s, we start to see the first implementations of self-reproducing machines in software with Neil Sparacelli, who I mentioned earlier, and also some simple hardware self-reproducing systems by people like Lionel Penrose, who is Roger Penrose's father, and others in the 1950s. So there was a lot of work in the 50s, but then, it kind of went a bit quiet again in the 60s and 70s, revived in the 80s. It's currently out of fashion because all these other topics of AI are in the media these days. But the idea of self-reproducing machines and sort of really autonomously evolving machines is not really in center focus, but I think it is going to come back again soon as people realize the profound potential of that kind of technology, and also the fact that actually there's no theoretical barriers to building a self-reproducing machine, like a real physical self-reproducing machine. It's all, the barriers are economic and technical, but there's nothing theoretical to say you shouldn't be able to build one. So it's interesting. It comes in waves, and so there isn't really any culmination. I mean, in our paper we're presenting in Tokyo this year, we sort of discern various themes that are present in a lot of these works about the intelligent machines, the impacts and implications of machine evolution on human society, and the implications for human evolution. So there are certainly themes you can discern, but it seems that there's no real culmination. It comes in waves and then dies down and then comes back again. Yeah, interesting.
It's interesting to me because it seems like an idea which is almost part and parcel of having artificial intelligence, having generalized artificial intelligence, or artificial intelligence that has a higher degree of generality. Is that a word?
Generality.
I can't speak very well. So it's interesting that it hasn't been a main focus really of recent, that we have maybe been discovering in cultural artifacts that the possibility of creating something that can reproduce on its own is a very interesting aspect of that design, and what are the limits of that. Is there some really interesting examples from your research of kind of the limits of some of that at the time?
Sorry, the limits of what exactly?
Or the repercussions,
of the technology,
should I say, of evolving machines?
Well, yes, there were. I mean, so a lot of these people in the sort of 1860s to 1940s did talk about what all of this would mean for humanity, and this was very much in science fiction and other literature, as well as scientists themselves. So one of the things was that, well, so the question, what is the ultimate end point of all of this, of machines becoming more and more complicated and getting more and more autonomous, and machines making machines? So already most machines that you look at, if you look at all the components, they've also been produced by machines, and it's it's an ever more autonomous process of machines making machines. So where is all of this going? And I mean, most people who have thought about this in the past foresaw at least the possibility that the human race would ultimately be overtaken by intelligent machinery. Now that sounds like a sort of scare story, a tall order, but if you think about it, let's take Samuel Butler, who was one of the first people to talk about this back in the 1860s. He said, well, what would we have to do to stop machines becoming more and more intelligent and ultimately taking over control from us? He said, well, the only way to do that is to forsake technology altogether and to have nothing to do with it and to go back to a simpler lifestyle, more at one with nature. And he said, obviously, if you think that's impossible and there's no way we could do that, then the machines have already won. And that was essentially, even back in 1860, he thought that technology had already progressed to the stage where we were totally reliant on it to the level where it was inconceivable that we could just suddenly reject all technology and go back to a simpler lifestyle. And so he also looked at various kinds of progression for machines relying on humans to build their offspring, but that process becoming more and more autonomous and less needy on the humans. So another question is, what will happen when machines become more intelligent? How will they treat humans? So Butler and others have thought, well, as long as they rely on us for some aspects of their reproduction and general maintenance, then they're likely to treat us well, and in fact maybe even better than might be a better state of living than we have at the moment. But ultimately, if we go down that path, there isn't any guarantee that these would not eventually become completely autonomous and have no need for humans. And at that stage, all bets are off as to what happens to the poor old human race. So that's one line of reasoning.
And that's a reasoning that you found quite, I mean, it seems like a long time ago, but I mean, it's only 150 years or so ago. But that's still a very current idea.
It is, yeah, absolutely. So there are other people who thought, well, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it would be more a case of machines and humans co-evolving with each other. So the machines might be used for things which the machines are good at. So doing fast computations and reliable work or drudgery, whereas humans would still be required for their more creative abilities and that kind of stuff. So it might be a symbiotic relationship between humans and machines, or indeed that machines we might use machines in the same way as we use our limbs. So they might become an extension to the body, and actually, so a sort of a cyborg vision of the future with machines and humans sort of fusing into one. So they're different ideas of where all this may take us. But again, all of these concepts, which are the focus of current debates, people have been talking about this for 150 years or more.
Yes, which is super interesting. If obviously go read the book when it's out. Is there some things that you would urge people to maybe look at if they were interested in having kind of a broad overview or really interesting insight into how people were thinking at the time, maybe what books they should read or what things they should look at?
Yes. Well, so there's the paper that we're presenting in Tokyo is online already, so people can download that.
Right.
But actually, I have just set up an announcement list for information regarding the book and the paper and these sorts of issues. So if anyone is interested, you can go to my webpage, which is just timt.co, so timt.co, and you'll find a link there to an announcement list. You can sign up, and I shall be posting information about the book when the publication details are out. I shall post a link to the Tokyo paper and any other related information. So that would be the thing to do. Also, my Twitter account, I tweet about these things. So my Twitter account is at Dr. Tim T. That's DRTIMT.
Great. So you said that you were also creating products or services which use these sorts of technology. Has any of this research kind of informed the way you're going forward with those companies?
Yes and no. I mean, the company. So the things that I'm most interested in for commercial, sort of long-term commercial exploitation are the ideas of open-ended evolution. So that is having an evolutionary process either on computer or with robots in some form or other, which has the power to continually create new and creative Sorry, a lot of repetition there. New and creative, they're the buzzwords. Adaptations and new species in an ongoing manner. So
a new and creative manner. New and
yes, that's yes, absolutely, yes. So people who've tried to do evolutionary systems on computers up to now generally tend to find that you might get a little bit of interesting evolutionary activity at the beginning, but then things just tend to settle down into a more or less stable state. So there's a lot of work at the moment in the idea of open-ended evolution. How do we create systems which continually find new solutions to problems, become more complicated, and do so if you left it running for a year or 10 years, it would continue to produce new things. So that's one thing, open-ended evolution. The other idea is true autonomy. So which I believe you get to. There's a company called True Autonomy, isn't there? But it's nothing to do with that. Most work which calls itself autonomous robots these days is basically a computer programmer designing a control system to allow the robot to behave independently. But the kind of autonomy I'm interested in comes about through evolution and natural selection, where every aspect of the robot's design, its control structure and behavior has come about through natural selection. So it's been through the filter of natural selection, and the goal is to promote that organism's reproduction and continued evolutionary success. So I believe that evolution is really the path to true autonomy of agents having drives and desires for themselves rather than these things being sort of programmed in artificially as concepts given to it by the programmer. So I'm interested in true autonomy, as it were, and open-ended evolution. So those are the technical ideas I'm working on. All this work on the early history, obviously it relates to it. I mean, in terms of technical details, not so much, but in terms of the general ideas, it's very much related, yes.
Yes, And if you don't mind, because I would love to dig into that some more, but we can do it briefly. Otherwise, we'll dive into a kind of a second podcast length at that rate. When you're talking about open-ended autonomy or evolution, is part of the equation there increasing the complexity of the environment itself? Because obviously, when you can, I think a lot of the people listening to the podcast will have some familiarity with Conway's Game of Life or kind of simple autonomous,
Right.
systems which have a limited environment in which to play in, but exhibit some interesting behavior. But I'm guessing you're talking about maybe taking a similar environment as a starting point, but increasing both the complexity of the environment and in line probably with the complexity of the developing genealogy of the computer program. Is that somewhat...
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point. The complexity of the environment is a very important issue. And it's something, as you rightly say, in most artificial life work up to now, people playing around with evolutionary systems, it tends to happen in a very impoverished environment with very little interesting dynamics or self-organizing properties of its own. And of course, in the biological world, evolution has unfolded in this extremely rich environment with all sorts of properties and laws of dynamics in all sorts of different modalities. So there's chemistry, there's structural properties, physics,
gravity,
responsiveness to electromagnetic radiation, to sound, all of these things. And so, I think having a complex environment is very much a key aspect to this, and something that has been missing in most previous research. But then the question becomes, how do your evolving robots, agents, digital agents, come to be able to use that complexity? If you've not given it to them from the beginning, how do they discover these different properties that are available to them in the environment? And I mean, I should say that actually some of the most impressive work on people creating artificial evolutionary systems has actually happened in hardware, where the thing being evolved is an electric circuit or a chemical system. And people have found, so there's a case where an electronic circuit was being evolved. So it was a field programmable gate array that was being evolved, and it developed some unexpected capacity. And on analysis, the researchers found that it actually sort of become a radio, and it was picking up magnetic signals from somewhere in the lab. And so it's just that kind of thing, being able to unexpectedly pick up new forms of interacting with the environment.
I mean, in hindsight, that seems natural, almost, given its capability, its nature, then it has the ability to do that sort of thing. So it's kind of almost like, well, why wouldn't it do that sort of thing? So that's a really interesting example for sure.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you say, it's a good example of like what could happen in hardware or software, I guess, given the capability of being able to do something in a complex environment and picking up from different things within that environment. Sure.
Yes. Yeah. And so with software, I'm interested in using the web as an environment. So having agents not only sort of living on the web and maybe living on the client side and hopping around different computers, but also using the rich information on the web. So that would be the analogy to a really complex physical environment, having all this information on the web, but having the agents able to to discover that and find new sources of information that are useful to it. So that's one way. Another way would be to have a virtual world where people interact with it, and so that introduce novelty in that way. And maybe you could even have it open so that people can design different aspects of the environment. So it's a continually it's an open and continually evolving environment in that way. So yeah, there are lots of possibilities in software too.
So we're getting towards the end now. I was wondering, there's a question I always ask my interviewees concerning AI and the future, and that's what are you excited about within this area of technology, and what are you somewhat afraid of or pessimistic about?
Okay. Well, what am I excited about? I think I've just been talking about that. It's really this. For me, evolution is a great tool that has been popular. It's sort of the limelight is firmly on neural networks and all of that kind of stuff at the moment. But I think people are already coming back to the idea of evolution as a tool for these things that we've just been talking about, autonomy and ongoing creativity. So yeah, those are the things that I'm really excited about, and think there are going to be some big advances in those areas in the next 5 years or so. In terms of what am I worried about, am I really worried about any of these things I've been talking about in the book? It's easy to be skeptical about people talking about the world being taken over by self-reproducing machines, and it's certainly true that nothing that these people in the 1860s onwards were thinking of about sort of large-scale machines that can reproduce and evolve. None of that has happened yet. I think it could do. I mean, I think, as I said right at the beginning, that there's no theoretical barrier why someone shouldn't build a self-reproducing machine, a physical large-scale machine. And in fact, there are huge economic advantages. There are also massive environmental consequences which would need to be dealt with properly. But if you think about it, if you built a self-reproducing machine, you would only ever have to build one of them.
Yes.
And then it would reproduce. And so there's a possibility of exponentially increasing returns. If you got it to produce something useful, a product or a raw material, as well as reproducing, you could get those produced in exponential quantities. And people are thinking of using this kind of technology to mine planets and asteroids. So there are actually people in NASA and universities working on this kind of thing right now. So yeah, we certainly shouldn't discount that vision, but also thinking about evolution on the smaller scale, computer viruses, these concerns are very much applicable to computer viruses too. And particularly now that you're starting to see viruses like the Stuxnet virus from a few years ago, which are having effects in the real world. So they're causing real world damage on physical systems by malicious implementation or sort of manipulation of control systems in nuclear reactors or whatever. So I think that's it. These ideas and concerns about how to limit evolution of self-reproducing machines are very relevant to software evolution, and also nanobots and molecular machines and artificial bacteria, synthetic biology. All of these things are alternative media for implementing self-reproducing machines. So I think it's very easy to think, oh yeah, that's a nice idea, but it's not really applicable. It's not really going to happen. But actually, I think there are many ways in which it could happen, and possibly quicker or sooner than you might think. So So those are certainly worrying aspects, and I
Yes,
think
yes.
it's so what we try to highlight in the book is that they deserve careful attention about how to regulate these activities and safety aspects.
Yes, right. Well, on a low point there, almost. I think I should flip the question from now on to the fear and then the positive. So just imagine you heard the positive bit last, everyone.
Sure.
Yes, so it's exciting. We're going to make reproducing machines that have interesting natures, let's say. Yeah, sounds really great. Obviously, if you want to stay in contact with Tim, then you can go to his website, which is again timt.
timt.co.
Yes.
That's all it is.
And your Twitter
is at Dr. Timty, DRTIMT.
Great. Well, thank you again, Tim, for coming on the podcast. And I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, Ben. It's been great. Thank you.